Imagine sitting with your family, huddled around a radio in your living room. No one says anything or moves that much. There's no voice coming over the airwaves, just a slow but consistent beeping like you'd imagine hearing from the radar in a military submarine movie. It's the fall of 1957, and with every toll of that incessant noise, the Soviet Union is reminding the United States of America that their status as undisputed world leader needs updating. Most Americans can't believe that the backward, communist Russian Empire could possibly have beaten them at something so complex as aerospace engineering. Russians were just these dumb farmers. Communism could never contend seriously with the innovation of the American free market. But every 96 minutes, having fully orbited the Earth again, Sputnik 1, as it was called, passed over the United States, emitting its taunting beeps. What was even worse than the satellite itself and the humiliation it brought with it was the rocket that the Soviets used to launch. Sputnik was actually launched inside of a hollowed-out intercontinental ballistic missile. The Russians wanted to make sure that the implication wasn't lost on their American foes. The oceans are no longer your moats. This time, it was just a harmless beeping transmitter, but we could have just as easily reached you with the original nuclear payload intact. Talks of nuclear weapons dominated American news cycles for years to come. The space race had begun. If you believe the US Air Force Intelligence Branch, the Russians hadn't just cracked the code on building nukes. They had airfields full of them. The Air Force's internal predictive models showed an overwhelming existential Soviet advantage. Enter Stuart Symington. He'd been appointed the very first Secretary of the Air Force by Harry Truman in 1947, and by 1957, he was a powerful U.S. Senator from Missouri sitting on the Armed Services Committee. Symington took the Air Force data at face value and sounded the alarm bells big time. He went on national television, literally holding intelligence reports, claiming the Russians had hundreds of ICBMs. He told the nation that we had to pull out all the stops, write the military a blank check, and stay out of their way. No pesky regulation. Speed and autonomy were paramount. Do you see where I'm going with this? There was a rival faction that didn't trust the Air Force's models, the CIA. They suspected that the Air Force was intentionally inflating the threat to guarantee that Congress never said no when they asked for approval on more infrastructure and capital expenditure, buying more physical assets. So the CIA built the U-2 spy planes to gather hard empirical data. Just 3 years later, JFK got elected and the spy plane files came to light. Photographs showed the undeniable truth. The number of Soviet ICBM wasn't in the hundreds. It was 4, as in the number of fingers on one of your hands, not counting your thumb. Wait, does a thumb count as a finger? Anyway, you get the point. The missile gap that Stuart Symington had staked his reputation on was a hallucination built on bad data. But the billions of US dollars spilt building out the nuclear missiles in response were very real. Whether they were a massive overreaction or a calculated move of global game theory designed to reassert US supremacy, they effectively gave birth to the modern military-industrial complex, which has more or less been eroding American trust in American politics ever since. We look back at the space race with rose-tinted glasses, assuming the whole country was united in a grand vision. In reality, it was highly controversial. Throughout the 1960s, a decade not unlike the 2020s, the US was brimming with domestic tensions such as the Civil Rights Movement and the deeply unpopular Vietnam War. This backdrop and the seeds of institutional distrust already having been sown through the aforementioned missile gap makes it easy to see why polls consistently showed that a majority of Americans thought that the Apollo program was a massive waste of money that could have been spent on domestic poverty and infrastructure instead. The public was fractured over the physical trade-offs. And in a way, the skeptics were right. We never really colonized space. The man on the moon did not lead to interstellar travel. Not yet, at least. But the space race was never actually about the moon. It was about the technological byproducts built along the way. GPS, microprocessors, and satellite communications. It was an infrastructure war. Today, as we face a new race for artificial intelligence supremacy, we're having the exact same fractured debate, only the villain, China, has been recast. Half the country wants to accelerate to maintain global supremacy, and the other half wants to abandon AI entirely because of the cost to our local resources and our livelihoods. China is way ahead of us in energy production, and they're starting to manufacture their own computer chips needed for training and running AI models. Both of these are crucial elements in winning this new AI race, one that might prove to be every bit as globally lethal as nuclear missiles. In late 2024, China rocked AI news by releasing DeepSeek, a model trained for just $5.5 million, while managing to compete with the US models that cost 18 to 20 times that to train. DeepSeek shouldn't have been able to hold a candle to our models, but it did. This was our Sputnik moment. But like our Sputnik response, was the reaction by politicians and AI CEOs just hype, designed to clear the path for any future pushbacks? I don't know. But I wanted to see for myself, having never actually used a Chinese model out of patriotism, I think. So this week, I decided to test the hype with a fairly simple experiment that pitted the best American LLM models against two Chinese standouts, DeepSeek's new V3.2 and Moonshot's Kimi K 2.5. Here's what I found. Okay, so I wanted this test to be not only, China is ramping up, we want to see how close that gap is between their models and the US models, to see if this hysteria about this breakneck speed of AI data center growth is really warranted, or if it's more space race 2.0, where it's kind of started with a faulty premise and then built from there and really wasn't justified. And then the other part of it that I wanted to look into was the strain on local communities and specifically water. And I know that water is kind of a controversial topic with it when it comes to AI data centers, because you have the one side where people say, oh, water is not an issue. AI data centers use less than golf courses. But then the other side of it is the soda straw analogy, where basically, yeah, that's true if you were just taking water from a large area, but when they're going in with like a soda straw basically and pulling a large amount of water from a very specific area, it creates what's called a cone of depression. And anyone within that cone, depending on the depth of their wells could run dry because they're sucking up so much water from such a concentrated area. And there's actually a local example to me, which is just about an hour away in a city called the Dalles. Google is basically, through the leadership of the town, trying to petition to triple the size of the reservoir that feeds the Dalles, to be able to meet growing demand for the data center that Google already has there and has had there since 2012. I found an article in Oregon Public Broadcasting, which is, I feel, a reputable source. Basically, the Dalles is trying to expand the reservoir. This is raising concerns with local groups, and the city officials are claiming that it's because of population growth in the Dalles, but the Dalles really hasn't had much population growth in the last 15 years. They've only added about 1,700 people, bringing the total to around 16,200, which is just very weak argument to say that they have to triple the size of their reservoir just because of that small amount of population growth. And more likely is that it's to serve Google and growing AI water needs. So the models are one thing. China, I think, is picking up. I think the amount of money that they've invested into new data centers shows that they're not taking this any less seriously than the US is, and they're going full steam ahead. And so I don't know that there's really any turning back. Like, we are in this situation, whether we like it or not, and we have to try to move as fast as we can, because it's like a tragedy of the commons effect that we're all sort of racing to the bottom, and the rest of us that aren't part of these large hyperscaler AI companies are effectively just along for the ride. And so I think that the thing that is the most important takeaway actually that I took from all of this is that this part here. So the Google has been in the Dalles for a long time, and in 2012 they bought this old smelting plant and they refurbished it to turn it into their data center. And the Confederated Tribe of Warm Springs actually voiced concerns that basically, I want to read this part. It says, the upstream reaches of the Dog River are entirely dewatered by the city of the Dalles on federal lands administered by your agency. And the tribes wrote to the Forest Service in 2016. They said, this is despite the trust responsibility the federal government has to the tribes to maintain fish and wildlife populations. So after years-long assessment, the U.S. Forest Service assured those groups in 2020 that the city of the Dalles didn't have immediate plans to take more water from the Dog River because they're diverting it to that reservoir in the National Forest. for at least another decade. So this was in 2020. They reassured the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs that they didn't have any serious plans to be taking more water because the city was at capacity. And then in 2021, 1 year later, Google announced its plan to build 2 new data centers. And then again, we've seen the amount of water taken continue to increase because obviously in 2020, they didn't have the context that AI was going to come online very soon. Google probably had some forethought, but ChatGPT was released in 2022. And from there, we're just going to see a continued increase. The AI hyperscalers, they are forced by this game theory mechanism of the tragedy of the commons to have to go full out and try to move as fast as they can, even though no one really knows what the end game is for AI. We're all just racing at this thing that is kind of like this black box. Google is not going to be incentivized to take into account all of the considerations of every other group. They're going to focus on trying to win. And that to me is what the rule of power is all about. And I think that's just the dynamic that we're in as a world right now. And so I think if we care about, our priorities or things that we want to make sure don't fall by the wayside, we need to get involved in, whatever capacity we can. And I think that I'm not saying that everyone should go out and be a political activist, but I think that if we need to just realize that there will be things that get left by the wayside if we don't prioritize pushing back when we see that people are, these big groups are cutting corners. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you want to decide on something that is meaningful to you and get a little bit more involved as a result. And thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.